Naturally, as a DP, as you start to shoot more and more, you're going to make a lot of mistakes and discoveries. And these discoveries, these little things that you find that worked, you're going to bring on to set after set. And each time you bring this on to new sets, you're going to perfect it and tweak it. And you're going to walk away with a pocketbook just full of all of the little things you've learned over the years. And in my instance and Jake's instance, we've been working together for the last 6 years. I've been working as a DP for 10. I know Jake has as well. So in that whole breadth of work, everything we've shot, we've put together a section of all the little bits of discoveries, all the little things, the little tips and tricks that we've learned on things we've shot. And these are the little things that maybe didn't fit into a whole overarching section, but that are gonna just sort of serve as one-offs. The little things that we've learned on certain jobs. We're gonna show you what the tip and trick is, different applications where it can be used, and some examples where we've used it. Another tip we like to use is haze and fog. The difference between haze and fog is very strong, extremely noticeable in frame, really used for more music videos, party effects, maybe you want to mimic fire, maybe you want to mimic something that's a little more extreme. Where haze, I usually like to use it for atmosphere. Haze is a really easy way to lift contrast, because when you have haze sort of filling an entire space, you'll notice your really clipped out black shadows inherently feel lifted because light is sort of being, emitted and lifted with the haze. Haze is also a really great way to give patterns to your light. If you have a hard light raking through a window, you're not going to see the beam of that light unless you have haze, unless you have something for that light to illuminate. Honestly, I love creating beams of light. I just always find it gives my footage a cinematic mood. To create this look on your project, you're gonna need two things. You'll need a hazer, obviously, but what some people don't realize is you actually need a powerful light to backlight your haze. Because that's essentially what these light rays are. They're rays of light. So you need to make sure you have a bright light to illuminate the haze. Otherwise, you'll have a, hazy room that's not being illuminated by anything. So haze is a great way to sort of diffuse your light, a great way to lift contrast in your scene, but ultimately a great way to sort of see the directionality in the beams of your light. Now that you know the difference between a hazer and a fogger, here are our favorites. If you're shooting outdoors and you want to create smoke or fog effects for your project, the best way to achieve this is with the lawnmower fogger. This is definitely something you'd rent from a rental house, but this thing is great for fogging out entire areas outside. And it runs off gas, so it doesn't require any extension cables or power. This is great because, as you know, when you're shooting outside, you're kind of at the whim of the weather and the wind. And one take the wind might be blowing one direction and then the next take the other. So the lawnmower fogger, not being tethered to any extension cables, can pivot and be moved around to the perfect spot. Our go-to hazer is a DF50. This thing is a beast. It can run all day, there's no warm-up time, and it gives you that thin, consistent, smoky bar kind of haze look that you see in so many movies today. And another quick tip, if you need haze, but only for like 1 or 2 shots, they make this thing called haze in a can. And I know, as silly as that sounds, it actually really works. And this shot in particular is a shot from a short film where the sunlight was coming through the back window and I didn't have a hazer, but I did have haze in a can, and just a few seconds spraying that, I got light rays coming through the window. So yeah, keep that in your back pocket, keep that in your kit. It works when you only need it for a couple shots. single source lighting. We wanted to do a section of this course that was dedicated to lighting an entire scene with one light. Sometimes as filmmakers, we have to be scrappy. Maybe we only have budget for one light. Maybe we only have access to one light. Maybe that's the sun. Maybe that's something that we rent. You know, we didn't want to alienate anyone watching this who maybe only has access to a single light. So here are a few ways and few tips and tricks how you can achieve very cinematic and dynamic lighting with one light. If you're lighting a sequence with one light, make that light your backlight. If you're shooting outside, that's your sun. If you're shooting a music video, put that light behind them. I think an example that works really well to prove this point is a Lincoln Jesser music video that Jake and I shot. We literally just had a source for behind the artist. We filled the room with fog, and the rest, you know, is the video. And that's literally how we lit it. There was nothing else on the side. There was no fill. We let the shadows go black, and we just lit them with a hard light that sort of illuminated the fog. And that was one light, and it created something really, in my opinion, quite cinematic, and it was very, very easy to do. I think a great example where we used one light to light an entire scene was a futuristic single-take music video called Music Saved My Life. We literally used a 1K gem ball, which essentially is a China ball, rigged it to a piece of speed rail, and had two people move the speed rail to create some move around the subject, and it gave a really cool pattern around his face. We didn't have, you know, any fancy 8x or 12x. There was no fill, no neg, no backlight. One light that literally acted as a key as it revolved around his face. And you can get dynamic lighting by just using one single light. Another tip when shooting with single source lighting is for a night exterior. I mean, hopefully if you're shooting a night exterior, you have access to a bit more firepower, but if you are just working with one light, my suggestion would be making that light a bright HMI, putting it as far away as possible with as many stingers as you have, and angle that towards your camera, just backlighting everything. It's gonna backlight the trees, it's gonna backlight any fog, it's gonna backlight your actors, and this is gonna give you the most cinematic and I think elevated version of what you can do with one light. An example of this was a recent radio rental commercial that Jake and I shot, and we had an M18, we had a little putt-putt generator, we were sort of a small nimble crew. We literally put that thing on a mambo combo, had that shine across the forest, and had a couple actors moving with some flashlights. No bounce, no fill, literally just one single source, and honestly it looked great, you know. So if you are using a single source, the Lincoln Jesser and this one are proof that if you do have some atmosphere, some haze or some fog, it's gonna make your lighting feel a lot bigger too. There are endless ways you can light a scene with a single source, between the light's placement, the light's color, having it strobe. I mean, in a way, lighting a scene with one light forces you to be creative. Dynamic light is a term to describe movement and energy within your lighting design. This is important when shooting music videos because when you want your lighting to match the intensity of the song, adding dynamicness to it, having your lights move to sort of match the cadence of the record is very important. We're going to touch on two ways to create movement within lighting. The first would be DMX. This is having a DMX board, DMX lights, and a DMX operator. This is definitely the more upper level, higher end approach to create movement and lighting. And we're also going to touch on, movement and lighting by simply having a source for Lico and one of your grips or electrics, simply moving the light around to be sort of like a makeshift spotlight. On an ASAP Rocky music video I shot, we had mover lights that were controlled by a DMX board, which sort of gave like a rave and party effect that we were going for. So the lights were sort of moving and flickering and sort of strobing to match the energy of the song, because the song sort of had that energy. The treatment really wanted to feel like an underground sort of, rave or a club or something. So if I just had all the lights on and nothing moved, it would be a pretty boring scene. Not only that, it just wouldn't feel like a club. I think a real cheap way, if you don't really have access to maybe a DMX board, a DMX op, and these mover lights that I'm discussing, you can simply move a Source 4 LiCo on a C-stand to create a very similar effect. Because a Source 4 creates a beam of light similar to these lights that I'm referencing in the A$AP Rocky video. And if you just loosen all the knobs and have one of your electrics just move it and LiCo op, you'll see the spotlight sort of move through your frame as it sort of dances around. This is a very quick and DIY way to create movement and dynamic lighting on your set. Dynamic lighting doesn't always have to mean that your lights are moving or panning from left to right. Dynamic lighting can simply mean that you've got DMX functionality that you're playing with as well. If you have a sky panel, Kino, Astera, anything of this nature, you can achieve TV flicker, cop light flicker, paparazzi flashes. All of this stuff will achieve dynamic lighting. It doesn't necessarily mean that your lights have to LiCo op style to create dynamic lighting. As long as you're able to create energy through certain effects that your lights might have abilities to, this is great. If your lights don't have DMX functionality, there's a lot you can do with maybe a grip, similar to sort of our LiCo op fix. You can have maybe a grip with the flag, move it in front of a light. There's different things you can do to make your lighting feel dynamic, because the last thing you want to do is be shooting a scene and not be equipped to match the scene's energy and tone. If the lighting feels off, it's going to take the viewer out of the scene. For instance, if someone was watching TV in a movie, wouldn't you think there should be a TV flicker on their face? Or if someone was getting arrested, wouldn't you think there'd be like a red and blue cop light? Or if a rapper was performing in a club, wouldn't you think that the lighting would be strobing and flashing and moving? It's your job as a DP to interpret all of these things from the script, because the last thing you want to do is shoot a scene and the lighting doesn't match the way the scene should feel. And lastly, I want to leave you guys with a simple DIY, anybody can do this sort of tip to creating dynamic lighting. And this would involve turning your light on and off as fast as possible. And as crazy as that sounds, I've done this on countless music videos. Actually, before sky panels and DMX came heavy on the scene, I lit a lot of music videos with tungsten lighting. Basically a light bulb inside of these lights. You can turn it off and on with no reset time. So by simply having someone on your crew flipping the switch off and on at sort of varying rates, you can have a pretty affordable, low budget way to create sort of like a paparazzi flash or a strobe light. So yeah, this is a really quick way, affordable way, and easy way to create dynamic lighting on your next set. So dynamic lighting is essentially just creating movement and energy in your lights to match the tone and the feeling that your scene or whatever you're shooting should feel like. In some ways, you have to abandon everything we've taught you when you're shooting a single take. Not entirely, but to some degree, you certainly have to be less precious. Everything we've discussed, from placement of your lights, the quality of light, has pertained to a subject on a mark, in a single spot. And when you introduce movement and blocking that naturally a single take will likely have, you have to kind of abandon a lot of that, because if you were shooting a oneer, and you had your key light and all these siders and toppers and flags and all this stuff, and the oneer continues backwards and moves around, they're gonna see all of your equipment. So you kind of have to lean into other techniques for lighting your scene. For starters, I always find it's helpful to walk your scene out as you would. You can even grab your iPhone. I have Artemis on my phone, so I'll just screen record Artemis with the right lens and just walk the set with the director. And if you can kind of match out, where you're gonna pan, it doesn't even need to be Artemis. You could literally use the video app on your iPhone and maybe pinch zoom into kind of your shot size. Because all you're really trying to do with this rehearsal with your phone by walking the shot is kind of do the move. And you might see that we never see that corner, or you might see that that window is a lot more featured than that window, and you want to push light through that window. discovering where you're looking just with a real quick dry rehearsal is incredibly important. The framing doesn't have to be perfect. It'll just give you some sort of reference that you can review with your director and crew. And another reason why I like doing this, walking this shot with a viewfinder or a phone is, as a DP, I'm usually the one operating the camera. Either it's on my shoulder or I'm, operating Steadicam. And that rig is very heavy to be holding for a 4 to 5 minute take, So while you're rehearsing and while you're dialing and blocking, it's actually much more efficient to just do that on your phone so you don't have to be wasting energy carrying around a 40 to 50 pound rig. So at this point, you must be thinking, where do I place lights and how do I light a oneer if everything's going to be seen? So our approach after walking through the shot with the viewfinder is map out any zones or areas where you will not see. This might be a corner, a closet, an area of the ceiling that's out of frame. These are always good places to start to add lights. But beyond just sort of, sneaking lights in certain areas of your set that are unseen, one of my favorite ways to approach a oneer inside of a house is by using practical lamps. Naturally lamps are going to build in little pockets of light throughout your set. So as your actor or, your subject is walking through your oneer, they're going to get hit with little, patches of light from those practical lamps. And when you are using a practical lamp, try to switch out the bulb to a brighter 250 watt bulb. You can pick these up at most hardware stores, but this is just going to make your lamps brighter, and you can, actually end up keying your subject with these lamps. One of my favorite tips for lighting a oneer is actually putting a lot of the lights outside your set, having lights shining through windows. As a DP, you can motivate moonlight, you can motivate sunlight, you can motivate a street light. Anything coming through the window could feasibly be, a source of light from outside. So by putting your HMI or putting any sort of bright source of light outside of a window shining into your set, is a great way to approach lighting a oneer. Another example of a oneer Jake and I did was called Roadside. This one was shot purely exterior, so our only source of light was the sun. And we knew that if we shot this thing between 12 noon and 2 p.m., that it was going to look like shit because we did not have access to be putting huge diffusion frames and shiny boards because we were going to be seeing everything. So what we did is we rehearsed from 12 to 6. So for 6 hours, we were rehearsing with the camera, rehearsing all the focus and the blocking so that when the light was right, we shot from 6 to 7 and just shot nonstop for an hour and got the take we needed. And beyond just the right time of day, we also positioned all the blocking so that everyone would be backlit. When you're shooting a oneer or an extended sequence outside, try to rehearse and convince the rest of your crew, actors, and other departments to be facing towards the sun, because when you're shooting in backlight, that's a total cheat code for making your stuff look super dynamic and cinematic. It speaks to that earlier topic we talked about shooting on shadow side. If you're shooting towards backlight, inherently your actors' shadows are going to be towards the camera, which is shadow side, and they're going to have a nice rim and sort of glow behind them. So if you can orient the camera to where you're pointing at the sun or pointing, towards your actors whose backs are to the sun, it's going to look so much better. One tip I want to leave you guys with when shooting a oneer is, as a cinematographer, don't be afraid to make suggestions to your director in the early stages of blocking that are going to make it look better. They won't know what looks good, so you have to be the one to tell them, like, hey, have the actor stand by the window, or hey, can we move them near our lamp? Because if you're trying to explain to them that it's going to look better, 9 times out of 10 they're going to trust you. So if you know as a DP, as you're watching the blocking, that the actor's walking into a corner that's going to be impossible to light, stop them there in the early stages and be like, yo, it's going to look so much better if that person stands right by that window. Because if you don't call it out soon enough, the director, the actors, they're going to keep rehearsing that same thing because they think that corner is going to look great, or if they've rehearsed it 10 times, so they think that's their mark. So be very diligent about watching and framing the rehearsals with your phone or with a viewfinder, and call out things right away as they are working or not working, because last thing you want to do is be shooting a oneer or lighting a oneer and you're finding out that there's certain bits that are going to be so impossible to light. So call out creative suggestions. Trust me, I think if you're working with a great team of actors and a director who trust you as a cinematographer, your suggestions are going to go a long way. And obviously with the oneer, all these little things you can do to set yourself up for success are going to be huge. Watching movies kind of growing up, there was always a very soft film-like look, and you hear this look, the film look. What is that? Sure, they might be speaking to the grain, but I think beyond that, they're speaking to like the soft, sort of reminiscent quality that film has when you sort of watch movies from the 90s, 80s, and earlier. There is a certain look that's built into film that's so beautiful and so cinematic. So as we sort of advance our technology, a way to kind of get back to that look is by using filters, because there are filters that achieve very similar things that film used to be able to do, which is a lifted black point, lifted shadows, sort of highlights that are sort of soft and bloomy. So yeah, I mean, I think filters are really kind of getting the control back as a cinematographer. Your job is to really set the look, right? So I think filters are just in your wheelhouse of tools that you should be using to sort of not only make your images stand apart as a cinematographer, but to kind of get back to what initially drew us to cinematography in the first place. I grew up watching Jurassic Park and Back to the Future, and if you go back and watch these movies, they still have a very cinematic place in history. They look so rich, they look so beautiful and soft, and I think if you advance forward with these cameras and these really, really sharp lenses, I think they can sometimes be a little too sharp. First up are softening filters. So what do softening filters do? Well, like you might have guessed, they actually do soften your image, but more specifically, they soften your highlights. This term is called halation, which is essentially the level in which your highlights are blooming. And another effect softening filters have is they lift your contrast. So your shadows, the darker parts of your footage will feel lifted. This combination of bloomed highlights and lifted shadows is a great way to make your modern, razor crisp, 4K digital footage have a softer, more cinematic look. Softening filters range from Pro Mist, Hollywood Blackmagic, Locon, Glimmerglass. There are so many of these. We're only going to really touch on the ones that we've personally used on our shoots, but feel free to experiment. There are so many beyond the one we're going to mention in this course that will definitely give you different effects, and maybe some are a bit stronger, some are a little bit more subtle. But at the end of the day, the one thing you do want to take away are the strengths. Most of these softening filters they range from 1/8 to a 2, or maybe a bit beyond a 2. So 1/8, 1/4, 1/2, 1, 2. As you get larger on that spectrum, 1/8 being the most subtle and the weakest strength, and a 2 being the most intense, dialed to the max strength. That spectrum is kind of up for you to decide based on your project, the creative, or the effect you're going for. You might land somewhere on that spectrum. A good rule of thumb too for softening filters is to remember to walk off the strengths the more you zoom in. For instance, say you put a 1/2 and you're shooting on a 25mm. So you're on a 25mm and you have a 1/2 Pro Mist. And then you switch to a 200mm. Well, if you leave that same 1/2 in, the effect is going to be a lot more extreme. And that's just because you're looking through a narrow part of that glass because you've zoomed in. So a good rule of thumb is as you crash in, so say that 25, you're on a 1/2. If you went into that 200mm, you'd want to maybe step off to either a 1/4, an 1/8, or none. Because if you left that 1/2 in, like I mentioned, it's just going to be so extreme. So, good rule of thumb is you zoom in, lighten the strengths, and as you zoom out, maybe hike the strengths back. There are different kinds of filters too. There are color filters, and color filters, when put in front of a lens, will actually give an effect. From coral, antique suede, tobacco, sunset grads, all of these will alter the color of light coming through the lens. I love these filters, and I would even argue that some of the color created by these unique filters I've never been able to reproduce in post. I think, for instance, antique suede, if you're trying to go for like a warm, summery kind of vibe, I have done tests where I've shot with an antique suede, then pulled it and tried to color it to match what that filter is able to give me. And I'm not like a company 3 colors, but I do think that antique suede gave a truly unique image an effect that I was not able to recreate. Even in this modern era with technology, I think these filters still hold a light to a lot of these things you can do in post. So yeah, these filters did stem from, you know, the need in film where you couldn't adjust the white balance. You were either at tungsten or you were at daylight. So you added color filters to get these kind of in-betweens. But I do think that when you apply them to the digital era, you can get some really unique effects. So I do challenge you on your next shoot to maybe play around with a few, my favorite being antique suede. But yeah, there are tons of color filters you can do that will definitely give you really unique looks on set. Next up are effects filters. Effects filters will alter your image to create a certain effect. These are by no means filters you would use on every single shot, but when it comes to music videos or commercials, when you want to get a stylized look for a certain shot, these are great things to keep in your kit. Our favorite effects filters come from a company called Prism Lens Effects. They specialize in effects filters. They make a star filter, which will turn your highlights into a 4-point star. And there's another one they make too, which is the blue streak filter, which essentially mimics the look of a Panavision anamorphic blue flare. And perhaps one of my favorites is their kaleidoscope effects filter, which basically gives a kaleidoscope-like effect, you know, sort of abstracting and multiplying your subject. Each project is different and may call for a different look, but I'm a huge fan of getting the look in camera because, you know, a lot of these effects are impossible to recreate in post, just given how they manipulate and alter the image. The last kind of filter, and the more kind of commonly used one, is an ND. ND basically takes the stop off of light. More often than not, we want to be shooting on the faster end of our lenses to get more shallow depth of field. But if you're outside in the desert, or maybe it's a sunny day, you'll need to take down that light so you can be at like a 2.8 or a 4. So an ND acts almost like a glass version of a scrim, taking down the light. Each increment of 0.3 is a stop. So if you have an ND3, that's 1 stop, ND9, 3 stops, ND12, 4 stops, etc. All these filters mentioned above can come in either a screw-on version, which basically depends on your lens size, like 77mm, or a 4x5 version. And the 4x5 version just goes into a tray and gets slipped into a matte box. So to recap, filters are a way to create a look in camera. Instead of leaving it up to a colorist to give your footage a feeling, it gives you the power back as a cinematographer to be bold and to set a look. I often feel that other departments on set love when they can see an image on the monitor that's closer to the final output, opposed to, oh, don't worry, we'll fix it in post. So on your next shoot, try to switch it up with some color filters or softening filters, because honestly, when you use them, you'll never want to go back. Ceiling bounce is associated with giving or lifting the ambient light in your set. And if you're wondering what ambient light is, walk into any room, your bedroom, your kitchen, with everything turned off. What is the light doing? Is it bright? Like we talked about, is the window coming through? And if you are framing up and you want a quick way to lift the ambient light, just a way to raise everything up. Imagine you're in color and you just turn a knob and it makes it brighter, but you want to do that on set, obviously. So a quick way to do that would be ceiling bouncing. Ceiling bounce can be done with anything. Our favorite lights to do it with, if you're trying to lift the ambient in tungsten using a Source 4 Lico and literally hit the ceiling, you can see the shape it makes on the ceiling. And it's sort of a bounce, you know. Imagine what a fill is doing when you bring it in closer. That is a white card that is basically taking light and sending it back. Well, think of a ceiling as a giant white card or white piece of diffusion. So, you know, when you hit a light on it, even though you didn't rent the ceiling, it's white and it's gonna give you similar return to what a fill card would do. This does work best when your ceiling is white. You know, I've been in areas where if you have a wood ceiling or it's painted green, it's gonna send that color back down. This is more of a quick and dirty way of achieving what a softbox or a top light would do. With the ceiling bounce, I find it works best when it's subtle. I'd never make this my key light or predominant light source in my scene, but simply to bring everything up a few points. Just think about being in post-production, right? And just cranking the brightness knob up. That's essentially what a ceiling bounce does. I think the times where ceiling bounces save me is, when you sort of get those notes from client or the label, hey, this looks too dark. In earlier lessons, we've talked about bringing in fill to sort of reduce the contrast ratio. So basically by ceiling bouncing, you're globally affecting the fill of everything. Not only is there gonna be light hitting the fill side, but kind of everywhere on the set. So if you feel like all your values are feeling pretty good and you and the director are like, yeah, this is perfect, but you have that commissioner or that label who doesn't really understand cinematography, they only just understand bright or dark. The easy way to speak to maybe some of their notes is just a quick ceiling bounce above the set. If you got a white ceiling, throw a unit up there. Within a couple minutes, you could easily just bring the values to where, you're not gonna get fired. Another way I love to use ceiling bounce is when I'm lighting night scenes. The misconception of lighting and shooting a night scene is that you light it with minimal lights so it feels dark. But this becomes tricky because if you end up lighting the scene too dark, it can lead to underexposed shadows and a lot of noise. My favorite tip for lighting a scene that is supposed to look and feel dark is to use a ceiling bounce. I will bounce a light into a white ceiling or a white bounce above the set to send a subtle amount of light into the shadows. Because if you look at some of your favorite movies that are dark night scenes, they are lit in a way that still feels bright enough to see what's going on, but also still dark enough to feel like a night scene. Most of these movies though will build an elaborate softbox over a lot of their sets, and I find that a ceiling bounce will actually give you the same effect. I like to call this movie dark because this is how most movies approach lighting their night scenes. The best way to explain movie dark is basically dealing with your shadows, right? You're dealing with a dark scene by nature. It's gonna be dark, it's gonna be moody. You're dealing with stuff that's on the lower end of the spectrum, your shadows. The other end of the spectrum would be your highlights or the brighter parts of your image. But when you're dealing with movie dark, you're dealing with that lower toe of information. If you're looking at false color, if you're looking at a histogram, this is like the low, the shadows, right? If you step onto a set and there's no lights on, chances are everything's gonna be underexposed, clipped out black. So your goal of movie dark is just to raise the shadows just to the point where the camera can see them. Once the camera can see into those shadows and there's information in those shadows, you are good to go. Because now it can feel dark. Now you can have actors, your subject, your scene, everything can happen in this lower toe as long as the camera can see it. Your camera doesn't have night vision, so you may walk into a set and your eye, maybe it seems bright, but pull out your light meter, pull out your false color. Your goal of movie dark is to get your values in the shadows just above purple, which is underexposed, to a level where it can be seen. And here's the ceiling bounce being used. When you look at the before and after, you can see the difference a ceiling bounce makes on the false color overlay. The shadows are no longer underexposed or purple because there's light being bounced from above, filling in those shadows. A quick tip when you're using a ceiling bounce for lighting a darker scene is to set the Kelvin of the ceiling bounce to 6500 Kelvin. Because in most instances, when I shoot night scenes, I set my camera to 4500 Kelvin. And this will do two things. First, it will make all of your 3200 Kelvin lamps appear warmer. And secondly, it'll make all of your 5600 Kelvin to 6500 Kelvin sources feel cooler. And that's the secret. I love when I can use a ceiling bounce to cool off my shadows. Not only do I feel like this is a great way to lift my shadows out of that underexposure and sort of false color that we talked about earlier, but it's a great way to have it appear like moonlight or whatever you might be motivating for your scene has sort of crept into the shadows. And that's your job as a cinematographer. There's elements of the story that are important and that need to be seen by the viewer. And if it's happening in underexposed, grainy and noisy shadows, well then you're, doing a disservice to the project. So, movie dark and ceiling bounce, these are all ways that you can, elevate and lift your shadows in a cinematic way to where it doesn't feel overlit, but it's lit enough to where the viewer and everyone can see what's going on. Earlier in this course, we touched on the term high key, which basically describes a contrast ratio with little to no shadows. In a lot of ways, beauty lighting embodies this idea to the max. With this sort of lighting, there is no shadows. The face is evenly lit from side to side. Well, up until this point, we've walked you through our approach to lighting for, creating a cinematic mood. And that just sort of stems from our work in music videos and feature films. Our sensibilities are more in line with sort of shadows and moods and contrasts. But you kind of have to abandon a lot of that when you're approaching beauty lighting. So how do you get this look, right? So the first step is placement. Placement of the lights is crucial for beauty lighting. Instead of having a key light from the left or a key light from the right, you need to place your lights right above and below your camera. We like to call this a clamshell because if you actually look at the setup from the side, it does sort of resemble the shape of a clam. I think the best way to explain how a clamshell works as a lighting setup is to compare it to a more traditionally lit cinematic lighting approach. So here's our first shot. We're keying our subject from the left, and this would typically be how you'd approach lighting a low key, moody lighting approach with tons of shadows and contrast. And this would look great for a drama, but for beauty lighting, you want to light your subject without shadows. So that's where the placement of lights and the clamshell works really great, because instead of keying from the left and having shadows on the right, or vice versa, you're placing your lights on the same plane as your camera and your subject. Basically lighting the entire front half, eliminating all shadows. Not only that, but the combination of lighting from above and below, just fills your subject in with light. And the last thing you need to place is your camera. Don't forget when you're setting up the lighting, your top and the bottom elements of this clamshell, to leave a little gap in the middle to where your camera and the lens can shoot your subject. Step 2 is dialing in the lights. You can see if we just played the top light in the clamshell, or just played the bottom light in the clamshell, it starts to create shadows on your subject's face. So you want to dial in the points of both the top and the bottom to taste, to where you feel like your subject is evenly lit. Something to consider as well is making your source as large as possible. We've touched on soft light earlier in this course in previous lectures, and essentially by making your source larger, it'll appear softer on your subject. And since this is beauty lighting, softer lighting is going to make your subject just look better. Step 3, camera beauty tricks. Once your lighting is set, there are a few things you can do with the camera to really make your subject pop off the screen. First, try to shoot on a longer lens, anywhere between a 50mm to a 100mm. This is more of a portrait style focal length that will really make your subject look great. Secondly, is try to get your camera slightly above the eye line of your subject. What this will do is it'll force your subject to actually have to look up at the camera, and this will just look a lot more flattering. Yes, low angles are cool, I'm a big fan of them, but when it comes time to beauty lighting and trying to make your subject look like $1,000,000, a low angle isn't the most flattering. You're sort of looking up at your subject's neck, and I've been on video shoots where the subject requested that the camera be higher just because they knew that made them look better. But yeah, that's it. This is, one of those lighting techniques that's good to keep in your back pocket. Not every project will call for this look, but if you are shooting a pop star or want to light your subject in the most flattering way possible, give this lighting technique a try.